Good day to you. My name is Tony Ballinger from the Fighting Men of Rhodesia YouTube series. It's my pleasure to have on board today John Connolly, who was in the police and INTAF and the Air Force. So I've had a look at his synopsis, quite an interesting story. And we're going to pick up on a thread that Mike Norton talked about in one of his 4 talks, and that is seeing a UFO. So I look forward to seeing that rather abstract part of the talk. But John, welcome to you. Can you give us an overview of where you were born, where you were raised, went to school, etc.?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I was born in Gwello. My dad actually came out to Africa after the Second World War. He was serving in the Royal Air Force. And at the end of the war, when there was I think they call it decommissioning in those days, they were offered a boat trip to any one of the colonies of the British Empire at that stage. So my dad chose Australia. He happened to stop in Cape Town for, I think it was a 3-week period, and decided he preferred Cape Town, so he stayed in Cape Town. He then met my mom, and my mom suffered from asthma quite badly, and it was recommended to her to move further north. So they packed their bags, and my dad moved up and settled in Gwello in the Midlands, and that's where I was born in 1954. I have an elder brother, Mike, he's 2 years older than me, and a younger brother, David, who's 7 years younger than me. So that's where we grew up. My family was very much an outdoors hunting, fishing type of family, hunting being my dad's one of his preferred activities, but that's now hunting bird on the wing, pheasant, guinea fowl, ducks. He wasn't really into shooting, 4-legged animals at that stage. So that's what we did as kids. We grew up spending a lot of time in the bush, around various dams in the area, on farms in the area. And yeah, it was a great life. I went to Riverside Primary School in Gwello. And I must say I was not an exemplary student or pupil by any means. I was far too busy doing other much more enjoyable things than doing schoolwork. And as a result of that, I think it was standard 5 I had to repeat because I failed. And quite frankly, I think in retrospect, that was probably one of the best things that ever happened to me, because I decided I better catch a wake up after that and do some schoolwork. I then went on to high school, and I had my older brother, Mike, was attending Gifford Technical High School in Bulawayo as a boarder. And I was convinced by my folks that it would be a good idea for me to join him. So I wrote the entrance exam for Gifford Tech, managed to pass it somehow, and it actually ended up as an A-stream pupil in Gifford. Yeah, boarding school was an interesting experience, but mine started a little bit earlier than this arriving at the school, because Mike was my elder brother. I think he was in standard 8, as they call it here, or form 3 at the time, going into form 4. I was put into his custody and put on a train in Gwello with a trunk full of all your paraphernalia and uniforms and sports kit, and waved goodbye to. And as soon as we left the station, basically, my life went upside down, because my brother turned out to be Jekyll and Hyde, and he and all his buddies on the train decided they were going to torture the hell out of me in various ways, shapes, and forms. So I was quickly re-educated before I even got to the school in Bulawayo. On arriving at the Bulawayo station, my brother just magically disappeared, and I had to now locate my trunk somewhere in the baggage department and find a way to get to this high school that I'd never even been to. But fortunately, a taxi driver assisted me and went and dropped me at the hostel. And yeah, that's how it all started as far as 5 years of boarding school was concerned. I saw a episode by Roy Pitchford, Major Roy Pitchford. It was done a while ago. He was actually one of the prefects at Gifford at the time that I first went there. So yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed actually my high school. After the first 2 years, when you become a form 3 and you start getting some rank in the school business, and played a lot of sports. Wasn't a great sportsman, but did make first team and the inter-schools team in athletics, and second team rugby, second team basketball were my main interests. So yeah, I was there for 5 years. I wrote my M levels Let me just check my notes here. Yeah, in 71, I wrote my O levels, passed 8 of them. And then in 72, I wrote M level and managed to pass that with a matric exemption. I wasn't really sure of what I wanted to do at the time I left school, but my preferred option was to join national parks because I'd spent so much of my growing up beating around the bush. It really appealed to me. And the other aspect of it was that my folks at the time couldn't afford to send me to university in South Africa. And I knew that if you got accepted into national parks and you were qualified enough, they would in fact give you a bursary to go to university. So that was my plan. So I applied to them, waited around for a few weeks, no response. Every day my dad used to come home from work and say, "What the hell have you been doing with yourself all day?" And eventually I was instructed to go and sit in the magistrate's court and learn something about legal proceedings instead of wasting my bloody time at home. I did that for a little while. Didn't really appeal to me. And then I thought, nah. I saw this advert advertising positions for cadets in the internal affairs. And because there was an ability to sort of pick an option in terms of where you would be posted to from a list where there were vacancies, I thought, yeah, let me get out of home first and out of town secondly. And because having grown up in Gwillow, but then going to school in Bulawayo, I lost a lot of my original friends. You know, they had dispersed off to other schools and what have you. So, you know, I was almost like a stranger, come home school holidays and disappear into the bush for 3 weeks and then go back to boarding school. So that appealed to me. I thought, well, I can become a cadet and if they accept me, and then I'll take a posting somewhere in one of the bush stations somewhere in Rhodesia. So I went up to Rori on Salisbury as it was then on a train, had an interview, got back to Gwillow the next day, and within a week, they contacted me and said, "We want you. And these are your options." And the one option they gave me was Hartley, a small town to the south of Salisbury, between Salisbury and Katuma. And I thought, well, that's ideal. Let me go there. A, they gave me a house. B, you got a salary. And C, there was a sports club there, so you could play sports all day. So off I went to Hartley. Thoroughly enjoyed the place. Small town life was, in those days, was very good. The war was in its absolute infancy at the time. We knew there was stuff going on the northern border, but it wasn't affecting us in any way, shape, or form. And I was doing all the normal administrative duties that one does in internal affairs, firearms licenses and cattle permits and general accounting bits and pieces. And you learned a range of different skills. And plus, I was able to get out into the tribal trust lands, go and check population registers and do all kinds of stuff that most people wouldn't understand. While I was there in Hartley, I forget the exact year now, I was then seconded to the new Mudzi district. Mudzi Motoko used to be one district, and then because of the size of that district, it was decided that they would split it into 2 separate districts. So a DC's office was established in the old leper colony in the Mudzi district, new Mudzi district. But now a lot of the records that came across from Motoko, I think it was, were needed to be updated. So I was given an FN rifle and a couple of magazines of rounds because there were or had been some brief contacts with Zanley in that area. A team of about 4 or 5 DAs, and I was basically sent out into the bush for 3 months to go and do population registers and check stuff out and verify information. And so I was camping basically from Monday to Friday, go back to Mudzi for the weekend, and then go out again for the following week. And I did that for about 3 months. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Got to see some interesting parts of the country. Learned how to shoot an FN rifle. Self-taught, of course, shooting trees and banks and anything else that your ammo would allow you to shoot. And yeah, then I went back to Hartley. Got called up for the national service, and the Saturday before I was due to report, I snapped the LC ligaments in my knee in a rugby game. So that put me into plaster for 9 weeks or whatever it was, and that was the end of that call-up. at that time, or just after that, INTAF had indicated that they were going to start registering their own national service. And I don't know if you recall this, but they actually set up a training base at Chickaruby Barracks outside of Salisbury. And I was on the 2nd Ians, as it was known then, called the Knob Dogs. Because every intake was given a nickname. Anyway, that's the one we earned. So we did our basic training there under the very watchful eye of Robin Tarr, ex-RLI, Terry Wilder, ex-RLI. Who was the other one? Bill Chalmers, the drill pig, tall, thin, very, very prim and proper dude. Anyway, they were our primary instructors, and they took us through the ropes for our basic training. After we had finished our basic training, I was posted for the rest of my national service to Mount Darwin district. I arrived there, and one of my first encounters was with the late Lionel Dyke, who was the district officer there at the time. So I met him and I didn't get to know him particularly well, but his reputation preceded him, as you're probably well aware. But after a short period of time settling in, finding my feet in Darwin, I was posted out to Mukumbura as the 2IC of what was termed then the Mukumbura base, but it was actually looked after 3 other bases that were busy being established in the Zambezi Valley floor area. One was Chigango, Chiswiti, and Kaitana. Those were the 3 other bases. Now, what I mean by a base, you've probably seen pictures of that. 4 earthen walls bulldozed up with a walkway around the inside, bunker on each corner, and some buildings inside, the barracks for the DSAs and DAs, and for the white staff as well, and small basic facilities. Toilets was a long drop outside the keep, so if you got caught short, you had to duck outside and go into your business. They were very rudimentary structures, let's put it to you that way. The first job I got when I landed at Mukumbura, which was then under the control of a good friend of mine, Barry Mulder, he was a district officer in charge at the time, was to go and cut the no-go area cut lines on the Zambezi Valley floor. The no-go area cut lines is where they had moved people from their villages into either concentrated villages, which was just a conglomeration of huts, or a protected village like we had at Mukumbura. We had 3 of them, where there was actually they were enclosed with wire, and there was actually an access control facility put into effect there to make sure that only the right people were there. And because all of these people had been relocated, and many of them still had their lands and their cattle and all that stuff, and they were allowed to go out during the day, but then had to be back at night and accounted for. But the no-go areas were areas where nobody was allowed to go. If you were caught in the no-go area, you got yourself shot. And I had to go and cut those no-go area cut lines. So they got 2 bulldozers in from Harare, and I was given a good reference on the Mukumbura to Chiswiti Road, and said, you start there and you cut this cut line all the way up to the base of the Mufurudana Mountains. So that was my first job. Now, you must understand, in INTAF, we had no equipment. So I had no radio. I had 4 or 5 DAs with me, two bulldozer drivers, and a few drums of diesel. And for the first couple of days, it wasn't too bad because we could do the cut line, just marching on a compass bearing. But then in the evening, we would have to give ourselves enough time to come back to where we had sort of based up. But as the cut line got longer and longer, that became very dangerous and very daunting. So we decided, no, we'll hop and we will stay overnight at various places. Well, then right towards the end, one of the bulldozers started to overheat. So we then had to make a plan because there was no ways we were going to get that back to the camp. So we found an old dry riverbed and we tried to dig for water. As you know, in the Zambezi Valley, most of them are just sanded, but we couldn't get sufficient water for the bulldozer. No way of radioing for help because we didn't have radios. DAs were armed with 303s, old Second World War 303 rifles. I had an FN, and I think that was about our lot. So anyway, we had to put in an ambush around this bulldozer for the night, and then leave a couple of guards there with a bulldozer during the day, walk out, get to the road, and get a message to Mukamura to get us some water and come and assist, which ultimately they did. So that was my introduction to life in the Zambezi Valley. The one most amusing part of that whole event is you've got two bulldozers working behind you. You're marching on this bearing. And the next second I hear screaming and wailing and performing. And what had in fact happened is one of those bulldozers hit an old mapani tree, which had a beehive inside. And down went the mapani tree. And you know what bees are like in the middle of a Zambezi Valley on a really hot day. And they were attacking these drivers and the DA escorts. It was actually, when I think back, at the time it wasn't so funny, but it was bloody hilarious. I'll tell you what, these guys are running, beating them. And to get them back on those bulldozers and working was a bit of a challenge. Anyway, we managed to complete the cut line, but yeah, it was quite an interesting story. After a while, I forget the exact time period, it's so long ago, one of the DOs who was based out at Veki Base Camp, which is slightly northeast of Darwin, towards Marymount Mission Way, out that way, at the base of the Chibara Hills. Now, that was a seriously dangerous deployment. That keep had been stonked a couple of times before I got there. Once by the Salu Scouts, who decided, because they'd been in the concentrated village, which was near there, and they decided they were going to convince the locals that they were genuine tours. So they opened up, obviously shot high, but they opened up over the keep. But they didn't realize that Andy Olver, who was the DO there at the time, had a 2-inch mortar from the old Second World War mortar. So he started dropping mortar bombs around them. They weren't very chuffed with that, because the next second there was we had a base radio there. This base radio was going, and they were saying, "Stop, cease fire, cease fire." So yeah, but Veki was a dangerous place. One road in, one road out. The INTAF camp on the left-hand side of the road that went all the way around, the loop road to Pachanza. And on the right-hand side, about a kilometer away, was the police base. The police also had a set up there. And there was a flay in between. And I always wondered, what happens if everybody get between our keep and the police camp and start opening up? We're going to shoot the hell out of each other, you know? But anyway, touch wood, that never happened. But yeah, there was a lot of action and a lot of activity in the Chibara Hills. We would often witness airstrikes and things like that, because there were a lot of in those hills. Anyway, what in fact happened is I got summoned to Mount Darwin one day to Jim Latham. He was the district commissioner, RIP Jim. He died a couple of weeks ago, unfortunately. He called me in there, and in his office was a lieutenant from PSYOPs by the name of John Moore. Anyway, he then briefed us that we must now start acting like and we must hold our own pungwes at night. So we must go into these villages in the middle of the night, not to beat them up like the Brooks normally did, but simply to call them all to a meeting, pungwe, and then we would chat to them about the war and the gooks and why we weren't doing this or weren't doing that, or why the new bridges weren't being built because all the money was used to buy these firearms that we're holding, and we gave them a big war story. But on one of the nights, we were walking a ridge line in the Chibara Hills, and they're quite high with a lot of steep valleys. I was leading the stick. John Moore was behind me, and then I think I had about 6 or 8 DAs behind him. And we were going along, and as I said, they're quite steep valleys, and something caught my attention, and I looked down to the left. And here, just coming along almost at the same speed that we were walking, was a bloody unidentified flying object. And I'm talking about a thing that was a size, I would guess about 150 meters, not circular, oval in shape. Because I'm now looking down on this thing. It was probably 200 meters out from me and about 200 meters down from me. And of course, we all froze. There were flashing lights going around the side. I can't remember the color of the lights. But this thing then stopped and it hovered. And we basically crouched down and watched this thing for, I don't know what it was, a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, whatever it was. We're whispering to each other, what the hell is this thing? The next second, this thing just took off. It shot down that valley and was out of sight within seconds. Wow. No sound whatsoever. And John Moore and myself looked at each other and we said, what the hell happened here? I've never seen John Moore since that day. Well, I did, because we did a couple more patrols, but since that time. And we made a vow, strangely enough, that we will say nothing to anybody about a UFO, because they're all going to think we were either drunk or pissed or high or something. So we just forgot about it, largely. And when I saw that same, and it was, remember that Tubara Hills is really a bit of an extension of the Mulverdon. Okay. Now, when I was what's his name? Norton?
Mike
Norton.
Mike Norton.
Yes. When I saw his episode and he mentioned something that was almost similar, and it happened at basically exactly the same time when I looked at that dateline, 74.
And what color was it, John?
Difficult to say, because all you could really see was this outline and these lights in a ring around it. It was difficult to see what the actual structural color was, but it was an incredible experience. And I've only ever told my wife and one or two other very close people about it, because it was weird. But did we see it? Oh, yes, we absolutely did. Wow. And it certainly wasn't anything to do with our military or our operations.
How did your African staff act? Did they think it was something spiritual, or?
Yes, they did. They did indeed. They were not happy. It unsettled them quite badly, actually. We went on and finished our task for the night, but they weren't happy about it. They were definitely hyped up over the whole thing, because again, they'd never seen anything like that. So the minute that happens, the conclusion they come to is that this is some spiritual presence.
It most definitely is. That's why they see the little tokoloshes, which they're petrified of, and
yes, correct.
They come in and out of those craft. It's definitely a spiritual manifesting in the physical. Mm.
Correct.
Wow, very interesting, John.
Yeah, it was quite an experience, I must say. But anyway, to go back to the main story, while I was still at Veki, I had a national serviceman who was came and joined me there as the sort of 2IC of the base, and we used to do that so that we could swap out on R&R and things like that, because we used to do 6 weeks in, 10 days out on a permanent basis. And his name was Tony Templemore Walters. And what actually happened with Tony was that my Land Rover that I'd been issued with there actually broke in half. The chassis actually cracked off where the armor plating for the mine protection was welded to the chassis. So between the cab and the back wheels, it split. And the only thing holding my Land Rover together was the roll bars over the cab. You could drive it, but you had to drive slowly. So I was due to go out on R&R, and we used to do a run with the police from the police camp opposite us every week. We would do a run. We would either be taking some of our DAs on R&R or collecting others that had come back from R&R, but there was a weekly run. And we never went on our own. So there was always 2 vehicles. And typically it was a police vehicle, and they had what they call a heavy, you would remember, old Bedford or something. And I now decided to take my Land Rover in front, because I wanted it repaired while I was on R&R. So myself and Tony jumped in the Land Rover, and we made the journey through to Mount Darwin. I will never forget the reception when I arrived there, because you probably know of Rick van Molsen, who ended up as a captain in the RLI. Well, he was actually also a cadet with us at Mount Darwin, but he had applied to go and do the officer training and was waiting for his acceptance or otherwise. And he was sitting at the office when I drove in, and the Land Rover was literally doing this. Anyway, I handed the Land Rover over to the workshops, and then, as is typical when you're doing R&R, going on R&R, you go to the pub. We had our own pub there behind the DC's office called the Chungamiri Arms. It was quite a famous pub in Mount Darwin. You go and find your mates, and then you go and have a few beers. And Tony went around, collected whatever he needed, and he headed back to Veki quite late in the afternoon. And he was now sitting on this police vehicle, the heavy that followed us in. What I can't recall now is whether there was another vehicle that accompanied them, another police vehicle. I'm not sure about that. Anyway, I was sitting in Changamiri Arms having a couple of beers, very late in the afternoon, because I was only going to go through to Salisbury the next morning. And the next second, I'm called to the ops room at the DC's office. And the ops room was just a short walk from the pub. And I was told there's been a contact. I think it was 2 police guys that were either killed or injured, and Tony had been seriously injured. They were ambushed coming out of a ravine, and they were ambushed from behind, from what I could understand. So they waited for them to come past, go down, and then as they were climbing out, opened up on them. I may be incorrect on that, but that's what I recall. Anyway, he was very badly injured. He took a round completely through his torso, went through the bottom of his heart. He was in a very bad way. They managed to casevac him to Marymount Mission Hospital, where they stabilized him, and then they flew him to Andrew Fleming for further medical treatment. As I said, I was an R&R at the time, so myself and my fiance at that time, we went into Andrew Fleming to go and see him. I don't know if he would ever remember it, because he was still highly drugged and whatever, but he was in a bad way. The sad thing is that he actually did recover, but never fully. And some years later, he succumbed to that injury. So yeah, it was a sad day for the young guy. I mean, really, it was. So that was the Tony story and the broken Land Rover story. Not long after that, back to Mukumbura, this time because Barry Mulder had now got married and had been relocated to married quarters in Mount Darwin with his new wife. So I then took over the Zambezi floor operation entirely from an INTAF perspective. We were still busy building Chiswiti camp at that time, and also a concentrated village outside Chigango. So they were busy days. We did a lot of driving around in those days, and often on our own without proper radio comms. We in INTAF struggled to get any form of material support on essential items, weapons, radios. You know, those things are essential if you're beating around the bush like we used to do. And it slowly started to trickle in, but never, ever in the quantities that we needed. But yeah, I digress from that. Yeah, the one day I get called. I was at the base in Mokas. I get called to our ops room, which was just behind our house there. And I go into the ops room, and District Officer Ant Finn, who was in charge of the Katana camp, is talking to me. And he's telling me he doesn't know what the bloody hell happened, but some army unit came through there and just smashed down the gates that closed the road, the PV, because the PV was both north and south of the road through to Hoya in Centenary. And these vehicles just crashed the bloody gates down or broke the locks or whatever. Anyway, they managed to get through. And this is at night, because we locked the gates at last light and opened them at first light. So he gets me on the radio and says, "Can you find out what the shit is going on, please?" Sorry, excuse my language. At that stage, I was serving on the sub-jock at Mukas with the police and whichever other units were there. Then I realized, no, there's a new bunch of guys. They've erected tents behind the surf club and are starting to set up a base camp there. And I think to myself, well, these are the only guys who're likely to have been responsible for this incident. Anyway, I marched down there. I'm a youngster, 21 years old. Marched down there, or walked down there. And I go up to the tent there and I ask for the OC, and I'm told he's in that tent over there. I go to that tent, and here's 2 guys who I later realized was Ron Reed Daly and Neil Creel. And now they're studying a big 250,000 map that they've got set up there, and they're obviously making plans. Anyway, I walk, knock, "Can I come in?" "Yeah, who are you?" "It's Ron." So I said to him, put my hand out, shook his hand. I said, "I'm the DO in charge of this valley floor area." And I said, "Did you guys smash my gates down at Chiswiti?" Ron looks at me. He looks at Neil, looks at me again. He says, "Yes." I said, "Well, then bloody well, get some new locks and fix them." Looks at me again. He says, "Oh, okay." The next day, they were sorted. How he managed to do it, I don't know. Jeez. But they were done. And that was my first meeting of many over the years after that with Ron Reed Daly.
For the sake of our foreign viewers, can you explain what a concentrated keeper is, or a PV?
All right, a concentrated village is where the villages which are normally scattered out in the tribal trust land, each village normally has their own little cluster of huts, anything from 3 to 6 or 8 huts where their family lives. We started the policy of concentrated villages, we would simply move them into one specific geographical area. So they were not isolated little hamlets all over the place. So they would all be put into sometimes a fairly substantial piece of ground, but they were all basically clustered together. And then they would build their little bomas for their cattle and their chickens and whatever, as well as their couple of huts that they would have. And then they were able to leave there, provided they didn't go into a no-go area, and they could go and tend their lands and take the cattle out for feeding and whatnot. So it was more of a communal scenario than just all these isolated hamlets, which obviously were very, very, very difficult to monitor and to manage, given the incursions and the terrorist activity that was going on in the area. And at that time, it was serious. And then you had a protected village, which was that same clustering, but now normally in a more structured environment, and it would have a big security fence around it. And there would be a degree of access control in the sense of letting people out in the morning to go and do their daily things, and then making sure they come back in at night.
And that would serve two purposes. It would protect the occupants from harassment, yes, by the terrorists, and correct, it would deny the terrorists R&R and food and
random access to the population. Yeah,
and support correct, from the population.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, so combined with all of this is, again, PSYOPs from the Intelligence Corps, and I think also prompted by District Commissioner Jim Latham, was this novel idea of putting the spirit mediums, the local spirit mediums, who were very, very powerful and influential people amongst the common villages, putting them in a Dakota, and then doing a sky shout where these spirit mediums would shout and talk basically directly to these people, either in their rural homes or in these concentrated villages. And I did share a photo with you of that, with myself outside of Dakota on the Mukumbura airfield, with all of these spirit mediums in their regalia, their black regalia and feathered heads and whatever, climbing out of the Dakota. Never was able to quite establish how effective that really was. I don't recall it making any meaningful impact on the situation on the ground in any real way.
What was the objective of that? To tell the local people not to follow the terrorist path?
Correct. To not allow themselves to be indoctrinated by the terrorists, and not to feed them, and not to support them, generally speaking. And the reality was, when somebody marches into your village in the middle of the night and they're armed to the teeth, and they're particularly aggressive, sky shout ain't going to help you. So I question whether it really ever did work. Mm. But you may remember a spirit medium by the name of Parangeta in the Mount Darwin area, very, very influential. He even had his own gate through the minefield into Mozambique, because they had spiritual grounds that were still in Mozambique. Because the minefield fence didn't follow the geographical boundary, it actually cut slices through Rhodesia in order to be long and straight lines and whatever. So so he even had his own gate, and that caused a lot of anxiety, I think, for some of the other forces, because would have known that he had that gate. Yeah. Okay, then sort of two last things on the Mukumbura sojourn was that I also sent you a picture about a very young guy by the name of Matthew Scallon standing next to the minefield fence. Young Matthew was what was known in those days as a boy soldier. He had volunteered to join, but he wasn't 18, so he could not be deployed operationally. Anyway, he was allocated to me at Mount Darwin, and at Mukumbura, and he used to help with the radio control room and general clerical duties and whatever, and go for this and go for that. He was a very nice young man. And we in fact had two of them at one stage, but Matthew stayed on at Mukumbura with me for quite some time. And the very sad thing is that when he was due to demob, he went back to Harare, went somewhere, I think it was to Gatuma for a party, and was driving back to demob the next day. And he and the other youngster that was with him had a car accident, and he died on his last day of national service, even though he had not been allowed to operate operationally, so to speak. So yeah, very tragic. Young Matthew.
Oh,
yeah.
shame.
Okay, then in 1977, I decided to marry my then obviously fiance, and I did that. And because there was no accommodation, etc., for us as a unit in Mount Darwin at the time, I was transferred to Karoi district. So we got married, had a short honeymoon, and off we went to Karoi. And it was refreshing going there initially because I'd done close to 4 years of solid operational deployments on a 6 weeks in, 10 days out basis. And you get a bit tired of that, eh?
Oh.
But anyway, I got married. They gave us also a house just behind the district commissioner's office in Karoi. And again, another lovely small town, sports club, Twin Rivers Motel just down the road, very well known, and a wonderful community of people, and relatively peaceful. I mean, I was driving around that whole district from the Murdana Mountains all the way down to the Sanyati in a Land Rover on my own with a single DA who knew his way around, came from the area. And yes, I had a rifle with me, but I mean, there was not any serious terrorist activity in the area at the time. There really wasn't. There was an isolated incident, and I was made well aware of the fact that some of the very first contacts of the war actually happened just outside Karoi. In fact, I visited a couple of the places where it actually happened. But at the time I got there, it was relatively peaceful. Well, 6 months later, it was a whole different ballgame. It was a whole different ballgame. The Zipra moved in their droves. And it started to get seriously dangerous. So we started to ramp up in terms of numbers of men, because we just had a contingent of DEAs who were regular INTAF district assistants. Then we had to now start bringing DSAs whose whole job was paramilitary. It was defense, protection, all of that kind of stuff. And I had assisted on a couple of training courses at Chikarubi Barracks over the prior years. So I had been doing a bit of training. But anyway, what they did then is they sent me on the Snoogle Boogles course. Do you remember that? Major Peter Daines.
No,
held at Llewellyn Barracks. It was a leadership and instructional training program for all units. So myself and a chap by the name of Dave Peters, who was at that time a district officer training at Chikarubi, we got sent down to Llewellyn Barracks. At that stage, INTAF rank structure had just come out. I'm talking about the epaulets and all of that kind of stuff. And we were basically in uniform permanently, where before we used to spend half our life in civic kit when we felt like it, put some military kit on. And that confused the hell out of everybody at Llewellyn, because they had never seen this rank structure before. But anyway, it was a damn fine course. It really was a very informative and educational training program, and it helped me a whole lot. Thereafter, I assisted again at Chikarubi with leadership and instructors courses. I helped Paddy Gallagher. You may remember Paddy Gallagher from the RLI. He was then one of the training officers at Chikarubi, and he and I became very good friends over the years. And I then started recruiting and training. Eventually had something in the order of about 300 DSAs and DAs in Karoi. Set up new base camps, big one at Magunji in the Urungwe TTL, and two others where we had permanent people in the field. And it was a very busy time. Now, if you have any knowledge of INTAF, you would know that the only way you progress in INTAF is through writing your interdepartmental exams. Military behavior or activity had no bearing whatsoever on your your status in the department. You had to pass your customs exams. You had to pass your statutory law exams, etc., etc., etc. And of course, running around in the bush all day or training all day, I wasn't getting to be able to do that. I did some of it, and I was eventually got my substantive DO rank, but I found it very difficult to continue with that. And I started to question my choices in life. Plus, I now had a wife and a small child, born in Sonoya, because we didn't have a hospital in Karoi. And you start thinking twice, because literally you were putting your life at risk every single day, going out into and setting up those base camps and whatever out there. And we got a lot of guys who were badly wounded in mining incidents, in ambushes. Some who showed bravery of immense proportions. And I put motivations in through to our provincial commissioner in Salisbury, Mashonaland West Provincial Commissioner, for commendations. Nothing ever came of it. And I became quite disheartened, actually. So yeah, that sort of got me thinking about what to do with the rest of my life. Yeah, and as I said, the constant fight for weapons and ammunition was amazing. It was, I mean, I don't know if you remember a weapon called the Garden Boy.
No, I'm not familiar with that one, John.
Yeah, it's like a wheelbarrow, but instead of having a container on the top, it had a dirty grade steel barrel, and you'd load it as a muzzle loader with black powder and a fuse igniter, and then you would pour a whole lot of metal cutoffs down the barrel and tamp it down with 4x2. And that's the kind of thing we were using to protect our base camps.
Good Lord.
In Korea, we didn't have a single not automatic, machine gun. Nothing.
Good Lord. At
that time that I was there. It was quite scary.
Yeah.
It was exciting, but it was damn scary. On my Land Rover, I had a FN mounted under each of the front wheel arches that I could operate on a solenoid and fire around straight down the road. And I had 4 30mm cannons sticking out the left-hand side and another 4 out the right-hand side, mounted behind the cab. All operated on switches. They had a panel of switches on top the roof line. And that's how we were operating. So as soon as you came out of the tribal trust land and hit the tar road, the Kariba road, then you'd have to jump out of your Land Rover, go and disconnect all of these wires, make everything safe, and then carry on with your journey. It was crazy.
Heath Robinson, eh?
Yeah. So not long after my daughter was born, she was still in a push chair. My young brother decided to come and visit us. So he drove up. He was 16 odd years old. He just got his license. So he drove up from Gwela during one of his school holidays. He was still at Gifford then. And he came to stay with us in Karoi. So he arrives there, and for some reason I wasn't feeling well that particular evening, but we decided to go to the hotel for dinner. The hotel was literally 150 meters around the corner from our house. So we go there, we sit down, we have our food. I'm not feeling well, so I say to my wife, Di, let's go back to the house. And directly opposite my house was an open veld. And we walk back to the house with a baby in the pushchair. I go to bed. Di says, no, she's got a bit of cleaning up and tidying up to do. And I'm lying in the bed. Now you picture this, because I mean, like most young guys, we don't wear pajamas. We go to bed. And I'm lying there, and then I hear this almighty bang. And I think to myself, why does she have to drop the deep freeze lid so hard? Because we had just bought a brand new deep freeze.
Yeah.
And if you let it go, it didn't sink down slowly. It would literally drop.
Yeah.
And then there was another one. And then I woke up out of my dozy state, because I suddenly realized, no, hang on, we're under attack. So I grabbed my FN rifle from next to the bed and my chest baby, and I run outside, out the front door. And those old government houses used to have a small wall all along the front of the veranda. And I realized that these Dukes are in the bush there in front of my house, and they're firing rounds over the school and or trying to get into the police station. And the big bangs I'm hearing are now RPG-7 rockets going off. Dive down, Kalkhat on the veranda, and I'm returning fire like hell across into this open veld. Couldn't really see anything that I was shooting at. I was just shooting. Anyway, it wasn't long and the shooting stopped. And then up on the ridge, about 2 or 3 kilometers away in Karoi, you would still hear gunshots being fired there. What they were shooting at, I've got no idea. But all the police guys used to live up there, and I used to mock them all after that. But and because the police camp was diagonally opposite the DC's office. In other words, you walked across the road, and that was the police camp. On the right-hand side, going towards Kariba, we were on the left-hand side. Anyway, I then went down to the DC's office to see if everything was all right there, and everything was fine. And I get back to the house. I forget one thing. I told my wife and my brother and to grab the baby and lock themselves in the toilet, because that was the only really confined space where there were no windows, or except for a small window at the top. Because I didn't know what was happening. I just knew we were under attack. Anyway, I go there and I still find them in there. I've now got to sort of convince them it's safe to come out. Yeah. But the first thing my brother says, I'll never forget it. He says, "Tomorrow morning I'm leaving. I'm not staying here." Anyway, we convinced him otherwise, and he stayed on. But he was not a happy puppy after that.
But it's an incredibly exciting feeling, isn't it? I mean, your adrenaline goes.
Adrenaline, whoa, that kicks in, big time.
You don't know who's coming through the wire. It's really exciting, man.
Yeah. All right, then the Viscount disasters. Also a bit of a turning point in my life. Obviously, being a district officer and in charge of basically what was going on out in the tribal trust lands at the time, I was involved in trying to search for both of those aircraft. I wasn't I didn't have anything to do with finding them, but we were part of the general search because nobody knew where these aircraft had gone down. So we were just cross-graining various areas, just trying to find some indication of what had happened to these aircraft. I went to the first scene, but they'd already cleared everybody away from the scene. Still a very, very depressing sight. What did encourage me was the massive response from all arms of the security forces to that particular incident. Karoi was absolutely moving with people trying to assist in that operation. Sadly, I think you know the end result. I'm not going to repeat all of that. It's well documented. But it started to really get me thinking about the future. Then the second one went down. The second one went down sort of northeast of the Elephant Walk Motel. It was burnt down on the way to Binga and to Kariba. Not Binga. Well, on the way to Kariba. And again, it wasn't found in a hurry. But when it was found, I also went to that scene. There was absolutely nothing left. It was literally, I don't know, 150 meters of charred metal and bits and pieces where this aircraft had just gone in and just burst into flames and disintegrated. There was half a torso. You can say no more than that. It was left there.
Is that the one that hit the Donga, or did the first one hit?
No, the first one hit the Donga.
It
was the first one. Yeah, this was the second one.
The ditch.
The first one went down in Yorungu TTL. The second one was further northeast. Yeah, I think what disturbed me about that is having been part of that very intense process of trying to find the first aircraft and then recovering, what was left and the survivors, that few that were. The second one, there was nothing like that. Yes, it was found a lot quicker, which may explain some of the fact, but there just wasn't that intensity that we had seen in the first. And I don't know what the reason was, Tony. It just was not there. But yeah, so that and then the issue with having a young family and being constantly on operational duties, basically, I said to Di, I can't get promoted in this environment. I may as well get the hell out of INTAF. I didn't know what to do, but I thought, let me see. And my dad had a good friend in the Air Force at Thornhill Air Base in Gwella. My folks were still living in Gwella. But we went down to see them one weekend, and he said to me, look, I'll arrange for you to go and do a tour of Thornhill Air Base. So this friend of his arranged it. He was a senior warrant officer my name is not factual. But anyway, he arranged to take us around Thornhill, and he took my wife and myself through every facet of that Thornhill airbase, from the armories to the squadrons to the fitting shops, everything. And it was actually staggering to me to see what people with the right equipment were capable of doing, which is something we were not used to in INTAF. We were really running on the rudimentaries.
Mm.
Anyway, I was that impressed that I thought maybe I must actually try and get a job in the Air Force. And somehow fate has worked in my favor in many ways in my life. But not long after getting back to Karoi, I saw an advert in the paper advertising for people to join the Air Force Regiment, which was a new unit they were just establishing to take over the protection and defense of all Air Force assets, whether at the main bases or at forward airfields or on externals or whatever. In other words, the Army people were being freed up for deployment, and the regimental Air Force regiment would move in there and look after the Air Force assets. And I mean, that's essentially what we were doing in INTAF. So I actually applied, and within a week or so, got a phone call, went to Salisbury, had an interview with then Wing Commander Bruce Harrison, who had just been appointed as the CO of the Air Force Regiment. And I was offered a position with what was called then the Regimental Training School, which was being relocated or established and located at Faldi Air Force Base. Now, Faldi was the secret biscuit factory between Hartley and Katuma. So, and my wife, I met her in Hartley, and her parents still lived in Hartley. So it all worked out quite conveniently at the end of the day. I joined the Air Force. And I started off as a fifth-year sergeant because that was the only way they could match my salary. But that was only for a temporary period of about 8 weeks because they were waiting for approval by Air Force Headquarters or Minister of Defense for the establishment. In other words, the official positions for the regiment. But anyway, I then did an OSBI after about 3 months, and then I was promoted to air lieutenant, and I took a drop in pay. Can you believe it? Anyway, we slowly, I think, built an outstanding team of training professionals at the Regimental Training School. Some wonderful people there. John Cox, who later became OC of the regiment. He was a flight lieutenant, and he was OC of RTS. Then there was myself, and there was a small contingent of other training staff that we were actually busy equipping to start training large intakes of regiment airmen, regimental airmen. And yeah, exciting times. I learned so much. I had to do explosive ordnance and demolition, which I found most useful at the time and enjoyed immensely, although it could be quite hairy work. But yeah, my sort of job there was preparation and implementation of all training programs, supervision and management of the training staff. Yeah, it was an interesting time of my life. Talking about EOD training, we had a farmer who was a neighbor to the property at Faldi. One day he came to see us at the offices there because we had taken over the old Faldi farmhouse, which was a huge rambling building that had been owned by the previous owners before it was bought out and the airbase built. So he came to the house and he said, "Look, can any of you help us?" I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "No, I've got a safe in my garage, and I've got a whole lot of nitroglycerine in there, which I used to build my dam, because he had a big dam just not far from the farmhouse. And he'd obviously been doing blasting there and whatever." I said, "Well, wow, what's the problem with it?" He says, "No, it's leaking out the front door." So now I'm busy doing my EOD training. And John Cox was teaching me along with Peter Horsburgh, who was by profession an armorer in the Air Force. And he was being trained up to take over the anti-aircraft gunnery component of the regiment, which he later did as an air lieutenant. But we now go and we recover this box. Now, I don't know if you know anything about nitroglycerine, but it is highly sensitive to any kind of movement, vibration, and it will go off for just about no reason whatsoever. Now, we had to move the safe, three of us, out of the garage, down the road to a strip section of the farm road, place it down, then do the most dangerous thing, which is to open the safe, which we eventually do very carefully. And yeah, there's about 30 or 40 sticks of leaking nitroglycerin in this thing. Now, they're all stuck together now because they've been leaking. And anyway, we unpack these things one by one using wooden, basically sticks and other sharpened tools just to pry them. And we laid them out just apart from each other all the way down the tracks and then light it because it just burns, it doesn't explode. But yeah, it was a hair raising exercise. And then I became the EOD operator for the whole of that sort of Hartley Gatuma area. So after the end of the war, when there was a lot of weaponry being recovered from various sources in an unknown condition or just dropped off at the police station, I would get a phone call, come and demolish all of this stuff. So in Hartley, I got them to build a deep hole at the back of the police camp there. And then I would go down the hole and I would pack mortars or whatever the ordnance was. And then I would take PE4, set a charge on it with an appropriately length fuse, and then just blow whatever. And then, of course, everything would go up vertically. And it was the safest way to do it in an urban environment. And I was doing a lot of it to the point where the airbase is about 30 k's from Hartley. I was living in Hartley at the time, that I actually then kept PE4, Cortex, and the bang box and what have you at my house in the top of the cupboard, because often this would happen on the weekends or other times, and I couldn't keep running backwards and forwards to the Air Force Armory, so I kept it in my cupboard. Anyway, I'll come back to that a little bit later. But yeah, that's what happened there. Then with the growth, by this time we were running many courses. We had sometimes 200-300 people in various stages of training at any given point in time, and also did even officer training for regimental officers. I was then promoted to. No, I was first as an air lieutenant. Still, I was made the depot adjutant. We were given depot status, so we went from RTS to Depot Air Force Regiment, and I was the adjutant, first adjutant there. So I had still had a specialist training role, but now I was more on managing that entire operation. We had 3 messes, we had barrack rooms, we had two big kitchens, all our arms, ammunition, all our accounting, feeding of these people, impressed accounts, all of that stuff became my baby. So that also was a good learning curve, and I actually enjoyed it.